Good morning. Thank you for joining us for Research 411, a talk show focused on sharing best practices and trending research topics delivered by professional staff and prominent UT Dallas researchers from various disciplines. I am Tiffany Willoughby, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research. I will be your moderator today. Joining me are your presenters, Amanda Boone, Institutional Review Board Director in the Office of Research Integrity and Outreach, and Dr. Andrea Warner-Czyz, Associate Professor in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Together, they'll discuss principal investigator interactions with the Institutional Review Board, issues, challenges, and best practices. Welcome, Amanda and Dr. Andrea Warner-Czyz. Amanda, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at our university.
Hi, Tiffany. So I am Amanda Boone, as Tiffany introduced me, and I am the director of the Institutional Review Board office here at UT Dallas. And the Institutional Review Board office is really the liaison with the Institutional Review Board. And we are really ones that kind of help facilitate researchers getting approval for their human subjects research. The IRB will look at all research projects that involve collection of data from human participants, or actually looking at data that might be already collected for other purposes, such as tissue samples or data that might be from that was used for other purposes, like medical data or police records, those types of things. So we look at those studies, and we're looking for the risks involved with those studies, just to make sure that all participants of those research projects are treated fairly and are not harmed during their research.
Thank you, Amanda. Dr. Warner-Czyz, please tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the research that you conduct at our university.
Sure. My name is Andrea Warner-Czyz, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing, which is in School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And my research for the past 20 years has looked at development in children with hearing loss who wear cochlear implants. So all of my protocols have either involved children between the ages of 0 and 18, their parents, and I even have 2 studies that involve adults. So I've been working with the IRB in many different regards with different types of human subjects, including vulnerable populations like children who have medical conditions and things that we need to think about, particularly when we're working with the IRB. Because as Amanda said, we really want to make sure that we're protecting our human participants, not only to give them a good experience with research, but also to follow the guidelines that we need to do for responsible research.
Excellent, thank you. Speaking of guidelines, Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about the protocol and what kind of things individuals need to consider when submitting a protocol?
Absolutely. I think one of the most daunting experiences would be submitting that IRB application, especially for one of the first times. So if you are not experienced with the IRB application, looking at it, it could be completely confusing. I completely get that. What our role in our office is to help kind of navigate the forms and get your protocol in shape for the IRB to review it and be able to make those determinations so that you can just get your research done. So one of the key things that you want to look at, and one of the items that I think causes the most frustration, if that's a good word, is probably just the language. What type of language is the IRB looking for? My experience is that investigators have their protocol is completely, they have it from A to Z, they've dotted their I's, they've crossed their T's, they know what they want to do, and they are looking at the risks and they are cognizant of those risks. But there is an issue with putting that down on paper. So being able to verbalize that is one thing, but to then be able to put that down on paper is something else. So when you're looking at the language, you want to make sure that the language that you include in those applications are as clear as possible. You read the questions, you answer those questions thoroughly. And if you have any questions at all, just call our office and reach out to us and say, I'm not sure what they're asking for in this question, or what do you recommend that I put here, those types of things. One of the things that I think reviewers have a really hard time with is acronyms and jargon. The IRB is a very diverse group of individuals, and so we want individuals to look at the science and make sure that the science is sound, and we also want to just look at the procedures and have human beings look at it from their background and their point of view. So not every reviewer that reviews an application will possibly know the science behind it. So if you have acronyms, I know we all kind of get into our jargon that we use every day. You want to take those out. If you define a word one time and then you want to reduce it to an acronym throughout the application, that's fine, as long as it's really clear what it is that you're talking about. You need to be really clear when you're discussing the risks involved. You want to be really clear when you're discussing each step that you're going to have participants go through, from the recruitment process all the way down until even what you're going to do with the data after the participant leaves. How are you going to store it? How are you going to continue to maintain the privacy of the participant involved?
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. And Dr. Warner-Czyz, perhaps you could speak to how you generate a protocol for submission and address some of the language that you have to pay a special attention to detail to, please.
Absolutely. I think what Amanda was talking about with the language and using jargon and using abbreviations, that is something we're all used to, but particularly when you get to the consent forms and the assent forms for any children over 7 years of age, you need to make it extremely clear and explicit exactly what you want them to do and to write it very clearly. So yes, that's really important for the application. I feel like it's almost more important when you're asking these participants to enroll in your study. So one thing I do when I write is I try to think about, my mom, not that she has little kids right now, because I'm one of them and I'm certainly too old for that, but I think about what would my mom understand and how can I make it either that an adult or a parent, things that you can put in there to make sure that they get exactly what you want to do. And for the kids, it's there are excellent examples online, but really thinking about what do the children need to know so that you are being very open about what you're asking them to do. For example, they might get bored during the experiment. They can take breaks. What do they need to do if they want to take a break or if they decide they no longer want to participate? And knowing that there's going to be no penalty if they do want to stop participating. So just, I think, being very clear, getting rid of as many acronyms, particularly in that consent form, because you want them to enroll, but you want them to know what they're signing up for.
And that would include, if I can jump onto that, Tiffany, that would include even the littlest details that might not seem like it's really a big deal. We had a researcher who really they were going to weigh their participants, and these weren't children, these were adults, students, but they were going to weigh them and have their height measured. And the researcher was told to put that information in the consent form, and they said, I don't think this is a big deal. Why do I need this? It came back later that they had a participant who went through that consent form and had an issue with that weight being taken. And so that was something that they used to gauge whether or not they wanted to enroll in the study. So even the littlest of details, it might not seem that important, but you're reaching out to individuals who come to experiments with their own baggage and their own insecurities and all of that stuff. So you want to be sure that you are as clear as possible, like Andrea said, about what it is that they're going to have to do each step of the way in each part of the experiment.
And speaking to clarification, can you talk a little bit about the difference between the consent and the assent form, and also address when a signature is required versus when it is not?
Absolutely. So the assent form that Andrea was talking about is for children. It is important that we get the parent to agree to that, because the regulations that we are all governed by really require that a decision is made for each participant, and extra protections are put in place for those who might not understand exactly what they're being asked to do and the ramifications of that, and that includes children. So the parents are there to, of course, give consent on behalf of their child. However, we still want to talk with the child, make sure the child is okay with what it is that they're being asked to do, and that they understand that even if, you know, mom and dad say we're going to this place and we're going to do these activities, if they don't want to do it, they don't have to do it. It's their choice above all else. So that's the difference. We have different types. So if you're doing infants, of course, they're not going to have to sign or really even understand. But if you're working with toddlers that can understand when you're talking with them, then it's just a verbal, this is what we're going to do, so they understand. When they get to the age of 6 or 7, that's when you're going to have them start signing. And those are actually really fabulous. I love going out and seeing those with little hearts over the eyes and things like that. But then when you're talking about signature versus not signature, that is all related to risk. What is the risk involved with the study? If you're looking at procedures that are not risky at all, it's what we traditionally refer to as the minimal review application of the IRB. In that process, you're not collecting identifiers, you're not asking risky questions, you're not looking at vulnerable populations for what particularly makes them vulnerable. So we don't need to have those signatures for those minimal review studies, those less than minimal risk. When you're looking at, when you go into the expedited or the full board review, you really want some sort of documentation, because there is a little bit more risk involved. You want some documentation that we went through the process. Who are the parties that went through it, and they really did understand what it was that they were going to do. And you can look at the language, and this is really one of the reasons why it's important, is that if you do come up, then you can look at that document and say, okay, what did we explain? How did we go through this? And just kind of improve the process if need be. But for those that have a little bit more risk, then the signature is required. There are some that can be particularly risky for participants. If that signature on that form is the only link to a participant, you could ask for a waiver of documentation of consent. You still go through that whole consent process, you just don't get a signature. And that is for those participants that really either they don't want to participate if they know they're going to have to sign a form, or you just can't have people sign. And that would be if you're asking individuals who have experienced domestic violence, and something about that study really puts them at risk for even signing up for it. So if you have something like that you can then justify and say asking for that signature puts the participant at additional risk, then the IRB will consider a waiver of documentation.
Thank you for providing that additional clarification. Dr. Warner-Czyz, can you speak to recruitment? How do you go about recruiting your participants to become engaged in the cochlear implant studies?
Very carefully. Thankfully, we have a really good relationship with the Dallas Cochlear Implant Program, which is based at the Callier Center at UT Dallas. But also over the years, I've been able to establish relationships with people in the community, so audiologists and speech language pathologists and and physicians, so professionals who work with this population. The other thing that really helps for me is I recruit online too, so I will post it on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and things like that. And that helps me get more participants too. So sometimes it's local and sometimes it can be national if it's something I don't need them to come in for, and that they can complete everything online. So I think if you learn to be creative, I think my most creative moment in recruiting a baby, if it was a baby with normal hearing, my most creative time was I was on an airplane and sitting across the aisle from this woman with a baby, and we just talked because I talked to everybody, and I told her about my study, that we were looking for babies, and she's like, oh, that would be great, but we were both going to Florida, so it was going to be hard. It wasn't like I was carrying my business cards with me on vacation. So I actually wrote all the information about my study and my research on a barf bag and gave it to her, and she brought her baby in twice for me. So creativity is really important too. I don't think that that's the way we're going to do it, especially right now, because not a lot of people are flying, but you can really recruit in lots of different ways. But yeah, I think creativity is a good way to do it too.
Indeed it is. Thank you for sharing that story. Are there any ways that you can provide an incentive for recruitment?
Absolutely. Are you talking about when we can give them money or things? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Participant payment or along those lines.
Okay, sure. So there are lots of different ways that you can, in a way, thank your participants for joining your study. I usually will pay something, so give some type of payment to them. Right now, what we're using is something called a clean card or clean card, and so it's a little debit card. I wish I would have thought about this because I have some with me, but it's just a little card. I think it says UT Dallas on it, and you can actually go online and you put in how much you want to allocate for that participant on that card. So that's one way that you can do it. Some people, especially if we work with kids, will give the kids a little something, a book, a toy, just something small, but you have to be really, really careful that how much you're giving them, the value of what you're giving them, isn't going to coerce them to participate in the study that they might not otherwise do. The other thing for adult participants, I know that we have the SONA system. Are we still using SONA? And so that's a way for students. Sometimes I know in psychology classes, one of the activities they need to do is to participate in research in some way, shape, or form, and then they can get credit for their classes through that.
Excellent. Amanda, if you could be so kind to go ahead and address what happens. We have individuals who have submitted a protocol. They have taken care of the appropriate consent forms, recruitment procedures. What happens next?
Well, after you have submitted your application to our office, the first thing that happens is goes through the pre-review process. So we have IRB specialists in our office who are fantastic and fabulous, and they will take a first look at that application. They might flag some things, have some suggestions for investigators, and they have worked with the IRB for a while, and they know what the IRB is going to be looking for in those applications. They know kind of the hot spots that get flagged quite often, and so they are there to help investigators kind of navigate that process and get it through so that it doesn't have to go back and then wait for the reviewers to look at it again. Once the pre-review process has occurred, and the specialist will then forward it on to the IRB reviewers, who will, we usually say after it goes to the IRB reviewers, we give the reviewers about a week and a half to get back, and then with any feedback, the IRB specialist will then forward that back to the principal investigator, or if it's approved upright, then you get a nice letter through email, that then you're approved and you could start your study. I probably want to give a shout out to caius because the process is going to change a little bit. Not so much the pre-review, the IRB review, but just the forms that are being used, all of that fun stuff. We are going from what was a paper, because we were printing everything out and putting in an actual physical file, which was awful. We are moving now to an online system, so I'm really excited. If you notice that some emails went out last week, I think, that kind of set the stage for caius. And so the forms are going to kind of look a little different. The process is going to look a little different. But of course, we are always here to help. If you get in the system and you're not sure what to do, reach out, call us. We are actually going to have a lot of training starting this week, some more training next week, and then throughout the semester, the fall semester, for how to get into the system, how to navigate the system, and everything that's changing, everything. For studies that are currently active and approved, we're going to migrate those into caius so that you will have one spot for all of your studies that you can just look at. So we are accepting the old forms. I'll call them the old forms because they are going away soon. We're accepting the old forms for like the next week. On August the 10th, we will go through a 2-week process where we are integrating all of those existing studies into caius. So we are not accepting any applications, any new submissions, any continuing reviews or modification requests during that period of 2 weeks. And then on August the 24th, we will go live with caius.
Thank you, Amanda. That was a lot of information that was shared. What happened, post-protocol submission, and then an introduction to caius. I'm wondering if Dr. Warner-Czyz can speak to staying organized after you have submitted that protocol and the research is actually underway. I know that the Institutional Review Board will occasionally push in for post-monitoring approval. Can you explain to the audience and principal investigators how they can best stay organized once the process and the research is underway?
Absolutely. I think caius will do one thing that'll help organize us online as well. And like Amanda said, everything will be in the same place. But for those of us who've been around for a very long time, we would get those letters for the modification. So something that I started several years ago is I have a cover sheet for each of my studies. And so every time I have a modification or a continuing review, anything like that, I have, for me, because I like to be organized, I have a form that I put on a colored piece of paper, and that way I know when new things have happened. So I just keep everything really filed or in a very organized fashion. I think that really helps. I know I have a lot of protocol, so I did have one student, and during that semester, that would be that student's job, was to make sure that everything was kept up as far as organizing. So if there was a modification, what was part of that modification? When does the protocol expire? To make sure that you stay on top of it, because once your protocol expires, you actually can't collect any data or do anything with that information. So you need to make sure that you really stay on top of the deadlines and when everything is due. For the post-monitoring evaluation, or something like that it's called. I have been through that several times. One for a study, I think it was 16 years old at the time, that I had inherited from someone else. And so staying organized, particularly for things like that, it's really important. If you stay on top of it, it's not as horrid as you might think it would be. So I think just staying on top of everything and keeping everything timely. When IRB sends you the emails and says, hey, your protocol is going to expire in X number of weeks, that might be a cue for you to get that continuing review taken care of.
Excellent. And I do know that you actually manage the lab with research assistants, and you did speak specifically how you kind of funneled certain tasks to a certain individual and that was solely their role. How do you manage your entire lab? And, you know, do you have situations where you have different roles, for example, where you're a faculty sponsor and maybe you have a student as a researcher? And can you kind of speak to that a little bit and define those roles?
Absolutely. So that's something that we see particularly in our audiology program. One of the requirements is for them to conduct research. And so some of them will instigate their own investigation and so their own study where they are the primary investigator, the PI, and then I will be the faculty sponsor. But they're only here for a year or two, so they complete their project in a year. They might be working on a manuscript or something after that, and then they graduate. And so making sure that the PI or that the faculty member stays involved is really important so they know what to do. If that is a study that they want to continue, the faculty member needs to know what's going on so that you can have a really smooth transition if you're going to transition that to another student. Or sometimes I've actually switched when the student graduates. I've put that in as a modification that the student graduated, and then I'll take over as the PI so that I can continue that project. So I think it's just making sure that you know what's going on in your lab. I do have an Excel spreadsheet, so I can also track who's in my lab in what years and which projects they're working on so that I can track that a little bit better as well.
This was excellent information to share, especially with new principal investigators. Thank you very much. Amanda, can you go ahead and address the IRB side for communicating to principal investigators regarding the post-monitoring approval?
Yes, so the post-monitoring visit, as Tiffany said and Andrea said, shouldn't really be scary. It really shouldn't be a scary process. So what the IRB does is we will send you an email and say, yay, you've been chosen, because we're going to come to your lab and just have a conversation with you, look at your records, talk about what it is that what's going on in the study, how are things progressing. We're going to look at the how you're organizing things, and is it in line with what was approved for the protocol. If there are things that could be improved, then we'll have a conversation about that. If there are things that you're doing that are fantastic, and maybe I want to share that with another investigator and kind of keep that excellence going and share that. So it is really just supposed to be a conversation. We do document how the visit went. And so that documentation is also stored with study records as well. But really the purpose of it is to get investigators kind of ready, I guess, for other events, whether that be if they're funded by the DoD or NIH, and NIH wants to come down and do a side audit, those types of things. So it really is just that. So if you get an email, don't freak out. If you have questions, just give us a call. We can talk you through the process, but it's really just us coming to the lab and just hanging out with you for a little bit.
Thank you, Amanda. Dr. Warner-Czyz, being a funded researcher, there are certain requirements that you do have to fulfill, and your research assistants and anyone else participating in funded research do as well. Can you speak to the responsible conduct of research training that we do offer here at this institution?
Yes, I encourage all students and the faculty members who are involved in research to engage in the RCR, the Responsible Conduct of Research series. It really goes through in a systematic fashion what is expected of us as researchers to conduct ethical and moral research. And so this is something that I know the National Institutes of Health requires. And so if you're going to work on an NIH study, then you need to have conducted or participated in the RCR training. This is in addition to the human subjects training that you would do just to be on any protocol at all. The other thing is, I know for the training grants, this is something that they really appreciate when you can put this into the training grants and then show this is how it reflects on my studies and my research that I'm going to conduct. So how does everything intertwine? So it's a really good way to promote yourself and promote UTD's, the series that's offered by the IRB.
Thank you very much. And yes, it's a great way to make sure that our institution continues to receive federal funding. Ladies, we do have a question in the queue. This one goes to Amanda. Will caius be integrated with Redcap, or can you use caius for obtaining consent or sending surveys to the participants?
That is a really good question, and the answer is no. Caius is a submission portal, and that's really what it's meant to be. It does not integrate with other systems. The exception to that is it does integrate with CITI, which is what some folks take their human subjects protection training under, but it does not integrate with any other system. So if you are doing recruitment, if you're doing the actual consent process, that would still be maintained through Redcap, through Qualtrics, or whatever you are using. Caius is simply just for the submission and approval process and kind of organization of your IRB documents and records.
Perfect. At this time, we don't have any additional questions in the queue, and we are nearing the end of our program. I would love for each of you to share maybe what you believe or perceive to be your top 3 tips for principal investigators in communicating with the Institutional Review Board. Dr. Warner-Czyz, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I think the first thing for me that I look for when I review protocols is jargon. You can ask any of my students, that's probably the bane of my existence. So I want all the text that you're writing to be very clear. I want to understand it the first time rather than having to go through it multiple times. So I'll say jargon, abbreviations, and as far as interacting with the IRB, I think use them. They're there to help you. And so if you have any questions, I think it's really important to ask. Before I let Amanda go, I want something, I do have something to say about our IRB. So when we get the protocols to review, we are asked to return it in a week or week and a half. And I just want you to know how lucky you are. I have worked with other IRBs that will take months upon months. Sometimes it might take 4 to 6 months to get an approval. So I just want you to appreciate that when you're antsy to get your research started, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's been 2 weeks since I turned in my protocol. That is a million times better than what you'll get at most institutions. So our IRB is actually really quick in returning the protocol. So just keep in mind that they're amazing. Amanda, I'll let you go now.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you. Probably my number one tip would just be, it's kind of mirrors what Andrea was saying. It's just, she was talking about jargon and abbreviations, but it's all about being clear. It's all about communication. So that would be my number one thing to say. If you get feedback and you don't understand it and it's frustrating, don't stay frustrated. Reach out to the IRB office, because that's what we're here to help investigators navigate through the process. If something on the form doesn't make sense, if the question is confusing, if feedback you get back from the IRB is confusing, call us. It's so much easier to get on Teams, get on the phone, and kind of talk about things, because your perspective is going to be different from ours. We live in the IRB world 24/7, and so it just makes sense to us. But if we see your perspective and how you're looking at it, then we can hopefully help you understand how to navigate that. I have actually taken investigators through a process and say, okay, what is it that you want to do? Why don't we use this language? Because this is how the IRB is going to best understand the point that you're trying to get across to them. And so we will go and write certain sections together. I can't help you with your science, but with certain aspects of it, I can give you pointers on how to go through and navigate that. So number one, reach out, call us, because that's what we're getting paid to be here for.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both of you. I do have one more question in the queue, and it does look like this is for you, Amanda. How does the IRB handle collection of data in other countries? And if people are responding in their native language, are they still a vulnerable population?
I will say that with every question that I get, the answer is always going to be it depends. So it depends on the country that you are working with, and it depends on the nature of your study as to what classifies as a vulnerable population. I would say that just because somebody doesn't speak your language doesn't mean they're necessarily vulnerable, but they are at risk for not understanding what it is that you're asking them to do, which is not a good position to have somebody be in when they're signing a consent form or enrolling in your study. So what it is really important is that if somebody is speaking their native language when they are consenting, just that you have if you don't speak that language, if that wasn't what you were born and raised at, or if you're not particularly fluent in a language, how is it being translated, and how are you kind of assessing whether or not the participant understands really what's going on in the study and what they're going to be doing. So these are the kind of things that you're going to need to think about and build into it. I will say that the societies and laws and rules are different depending on where you are. So the IRB really understands that, and we would look at where you're doing your study and what is the norms, what is considered logical and ethical in those places, and then we would make the determination based on that as well as other things. But it's always going to depend.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Well, Amanda, Dr. Warner-Czyz, thank you for being on our program today to share valuable information with our community. Interested in additional Office of Research events? Please visit research.utdallas.edu. Thank you and have a nice day.